This screencast will give a brief introduction to blood, including the functions, characteristics, and components of blood. Blood is connective tissue. Even though it doesn't seem like it's connecting things, it is a connective tissue. And it's made up of formed elements or cells in a liquid plasma. The functions of blood, there are a few functions of blood. The main one that we'll talk about here is transportation. Blood is very important for transportation as it transports oxygen, waste, and hormones throughout our body. In doing so, it helps defend our body against infection or foreign invaders. It helps our body maintain homeostasis by sending different things where they need to be, whether that's sugar, oxygen, hormones, and it also helps distribute heat. If you recall, vasoconstriction is a narrowing of the blood vessels. This will help us conserve heat by keeping it away from the surface of our skin so that it doesn't radiate out to the environment. Or vasodilation, which is why our skin gets red, either after sunburn or after when we're exercising or when we're just warm. That will bring blood to the surface of our skin so that the heat can radiate out into the environment. When we talk about transportation, we're mainly going to be talking about oxygen and talking about the transportation of oxygen via red blood cells once it's already in the body. So the red blood cells will pick up this oxygen in the lungs and it will bring it to the cells that need it. As we know, blood is red, it is a liquid, and it is slightly thick liquid, so it is a viscous liquid. It is also slightly sticky, and some may also mention here that it has a slightly metallic taste, which we all know from cutting our mouth or our tongue or our lip, and that is because of the iron that's in our blood. There are 4 components of blood. Plasma is the liquid part. Its job is to transport the formed elements throughout the body. Red blood cells, which can be abbreviated as RBC when you're writing it out, carry oxygen. White blood cells, or WBCs when you're writing it out, fight infection. And platelets help the blood clot. We're going to go over each one of these in a little bit more detail later on in this screencast. This is the composition of blood. So the exact numbers are not necessarily important, but what is important is to remember that plasma, or the liquid part, makes up a little bit more than half of your blood by volume. It's about 55%. The formed elements, or cells and cell fragments, make up a little less than half, about 45%. Of those formed elements, you can see that about 95% or even more, sometimes listed up to 99% of the formed elements are red blood cells, normally. We'll talk more about that when we talk about white blood cells. And then you have lots of different types of white blood cells. You can see neutrophils are the most prevalent. When we're talking about plasma, plasma is more than 90% water. And then most of the rest of that is 3 proteins that we'll talk about later in this screencast. The last percent is made up of electrolytes, waste, nutrients, vitamins, hormones, and lots of different gases carried in or dissolved in the plasma. These might not make up a lot of the volume of blood, but they are very, very important to our body's functioning and to maintaining homeostasis. When you look at the test tube on the right, this test tube would have been put in a centrifuge, which is you put it in the machine and it spins it around so that the heavier elements go towards the bottom. And so there you can see the red blood cells, the plasma, and then the tiny little layer of a buffy coat, they call it, which is white blood cells and platelets. The red blood cell, which makes up, again, about most of that 45%, the percentage of red blood cells in your blood is called your hematocrit, and that's a number that people will look at specifically with anemia and with your ability to carry oxygen. All right, first we'll talk about blood plasma. Blood plasma is the liquid part of your blood. It's clear but has a little bit of a yellow tint to it, so it's said to be straw colored. As I mentioned, it makes up about 55% of your volume of your blood. 92-ish% of that is water, 7% proteins, which we'll talk about in a second, and then 1% all of those other things: electrolytes, wastes, nutrients, vitamins, hormones, gases, etc. There are three plasma proteins, or three main types of plasma proteins, that are mainly produced by the liver. The one we'll focus on most in this unit is fibrinogen, as it's a main character, main player, has a big role in hemostasis, which is forming blood clots. Fibrinogen is going to be converted into fibrin, and fibrin is what is going to help form a blood clot to stop bleeding. You also have albumins, which help control the volume of your blood and your blood pressure, and you have globulins, which transport lipids or fats, as well as fat-soluble vitamins A, D, E, and K, and they also help make up antibodies. Next, we have red blood cells. Red blood cells are technically called erythrocytes. Erythro meaning red and cyte meaning cell. So these are red cells. Red blood cells are mostly produced in red bone marrow. They make up, as I mentioned before, the majority of formed elements by a lot. 95 up to 99% of our formed elements, again, formed elements meaning red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. The average lifespan of a red blood cell is 120 days. Then it will be broken down and recycled, or parts eliminated from your body in order to do other things. So we want to keep our red blood cells nice and healthy, so they are recycled or replaced very frequently. This will also affect how frequently you can give blood, because we want to make sure you have enough red blood cells when you're donating blood, both for the blood that you're giving as well as for your own body after you give your blood. The function of red blood cells are to transport gases, as we mentioned before. They have a biconcave shape, which means they curve inward on both sides, and they are one of the only eukaryotic cells that don't have a nucleus. Because they don't have a nucleus and they curve in on both sides, they have an increased surface area that oxygen and other gases can bind to. So because of that dip, we have more surface area, which means a greater ability to carry gases. Again, structure is connected to function. About a third of the volume of this red blood cell is a molecule called hemoglobin. Hemoglobin has two states. It can either be carrying oxygen or it's not carrying oxygen. If hemoglobin is carrying oxygen, we call it oxyhemoglobin. If hemoglobin is not carrying oxygen, we call it deoxyhemoglobin. Both are forms of hemoglobin. One's carrying oxygen and one is not carrying oxygen. It's like having a light switch, and a light switch is always a light switch, but sometimes it's in the on position and sometimes it's in the off position. When hemoglobin is carrying oxygen, so the blood is oxygenated, it is bright red. When it is deoxygenated, it is a darker, deeper, almost purpley kind of red. In diagrams, you'll see oxygenated blood colored as red and deoxygenated blood as blue, but our blood is not blue, it's a deep red. Next, we move on to white blood cells, or leukocytes. Again, cyte means cell, and leuko means white, so these are white blood cells. White blood cells help protect us against disease. They're transported by the blood, by the plasma, to the infection site when they're needed, but they're always circulating around in our body. When we need more, our hemocytoblasts, which are our blood stem cells, will differentiate to form more white blood cells. So if you get blood work done and there are elevated white blood cells, or white blood cell levels, it is a marker for disease. We're also going to we'll talk about white blood cells a little bit here because they're part of the blood. However, the white blood cells don't really have a role, or they don't have a role, in transporting oxygen, which is the focus of our blood cardiovascular respiratory system unit. However, we will talk about these a lot when we talk about the immune system. The immune system is not a technical organ system. Instead, there are different parts and pieces from different systems that all work together to protect our body against foreign invaders. There are 5 types of leukocytes that we're going to talk about. Neutrophils make up the majority of white blood cells, and they are the first to respond to infection. When they respond to infection, they carry out phagocytosis, or cellular eating, of small particles like bacteria and fungi. Next, we have eosinophils. That's not spelled wrong, but Microsoft thinks it is. They attack parasites and cancer cells and help with allergic responses. The key word there is help, because they are not the primary white blood cell responsible for allergic responses. Basophils are the primary white blood cell that really sounds the alarm against allergens, foreign invaders, and releases heparin and histamine, which are 2 biochemicals that will start the inflammation process. So you may be familiar with histamine if you have allergies to pollen. You go outside in the spring or the fall, your eyes get watery, your throat gets itchy, you start sneezing a lot, your nose is runny. That is because of heparin and histamine, which were triggered by the basophils. We'll talk more about allergens in the immune system, but allergens essentially are something that triggers an immune response that shouldn't necessarily trigger an immune response. So pollen shouldn't be dangerous to us, or peanuts shouldn't be dangerous to us, but if you have an allergy against these things, the basophils will respond with an allergic reaction. Next, we have monocytes. Monocytes are really big. They help break down or eat large particles. They help with bacteria, and you're going to see monocyte levels elevated when you have more chronic infections. So these are long-term infections. They also play a role in boosting immunity. However, when we talk about immunity and the immune system, we're mostly talking about lymphocytes. Lymphocytes play a huge role in immunity, and they're a big part of our immune system. You have probably heard of B cells and T cells, or B lymphocytes and T lymphocytes. Lymphocytes produce antibodies that are used to fight bacteria, viruses, toxins, etc. So we get these lymphocytes. Our body produces them when we are exposed to a disease, whether that exposure is through the environment or it's through vaccination. The last component we're going to talk about are platelets. Platelets are also called thrombocytes. I mention this because when we look at a lot of the clotting or platelet disorders, we'll see that word thrombo repeated over and over. Platelets are cell fragments. They don't have a nucleus, and they're small, about half the size of a red blood cell. They aid in stopping bleeding. The process of stopping bleeding is called hemostasis. Hemo meaning blood, and stasis meaning stopping, standing, or halting. And so that is the process that's going to cause our blood to clot so that we don't bleed. This is normally a good process, but there are disorders or diseases that will affect this process and either make you clot too much or not clot at all. We'll talk about those and hemostasis in a different screencast. This is a quick overview of the functions, characteristics, and components of blood.